Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about a lesson plan for teaching business or professional writing students to write negative messages or to deliver bad news. So I emphasize for my students that this is a lot more challenging than writing routine or positive messages, which tend to be much more straightforward. With bad news messages or sensitive messages, you have to be very cautious about how you approach these, because readers are more likely to become angry or to become sad as soon as they get that bad news, which means you want to structure your message in such a way that the reasons, the explanation for that bad news is given beforehand, so that readers are more open and sympathetic to considering your perspective before they actually get that emotional bad news. And that's very, very difficult to do. So what I do for this lesson plan is I start by going over the basic structure of a bad news message. And in my video about composing negative messages, I talk about that more extensively. But basically, there's a 4-part structure, right? So you start with a buffer. And I explain briefly what the buffer is. That it's neutral or mildly positive news that opens the message and gets the reader into a neutral-ish state of mind. So you're trying to open without negativity. Then you provide the reasons, explanation, whatever it is, to explain, to justify this bad news. Whatever this situation is, whatever the decision is, whatever, you need to explain why. Give us the reasons why. Then you very quickly and cleanly deliver the bad news. So you should directly state it so there's no ambiguity, but you want to spend as little time on that bad news as possible. Then the 4th stage of the message is going to be to develop goodwill. So you want to try and rebuild connections. So one of the things that I tend to do, I encourage my students to think about the audience for a bad news message as Stanley Hudson from The Office. So I'll typically show them a short clip of Stanley Hudson getting upset. I used the clip on YouTube, Michael fake fires Stanley. And I just used the section where Stanley gets really, really upset. Basically from the point where Michael says, "You're fired," up through the point where Michael tells everybody else to get out. If you don't look up the clip, that's not going to be that useful for you, but that's a really good one if you want a short clip to show an angry reaction to bad news. So that's how I sort of encourage my students to understand this and to think about these negative messages and why it's important to structure them in this way. Then we look at a couple of sample messages, short negative messages. I've actually just scanned a couple out of the textbook that I'm teaching out of this semester, but you could write your own if you don't have access to a textbook or you don't want to find things online, stuff like that. So these are very, very short messages. They go 1, 2, 3, 4, basically through the 4-part structure. So they're excellent models of doing this without much that could really be changed. And I actually annotated them. So I marked on there buffer, reasons, bad news, goodwill on each of these messages. I did talk about some minor rewrites I might do on one of them, switching a sentence around, etc., etc. That really depends on what models you choose, how much, if anything, you would recommend changing. It also depends on why you're teaching this lesson. Like for me, this lesson is setting up for our correspondence packet, where students are writing a series of short professional messages. So they're going to have to practice this skill. So we talk about those two models, and I would recommend using at least two so students can get a little bit of a sense of this. Then we move on and we look at three models, real-world, professionally written models of bad news messages. Now, I use an email that Target sent out shortly after a data breach, in which they apologize, they explain what happened to a certain extent. Like, they explain that stuff was hacked. They don't actually talk about what they're doing to fix it or why the problem arose in the first place. And they offer compensation in the form of I want to say, I forget what it is, some sort of identity monitoring software, a year-long subscription. So that's the first message. The second message is Jack Dorsey's Twitter memo, in which he announced that 336 people were going to lose their jobs from Twitter, so that the company could move forward in a more streamlined and efficient fashion. And then the third message is from Stephen Elop at Microsoft, in which he announced the firing of 12,500 Microsoft employees in what's possibly one of the worst written messages that's ever been written in the professional sphere ever in the history of the professional sphere. Now, with that one, I actually have it. I have that message through a New York Magazine article, and in between the sections of Elop's message, the New York Magazine author has written his own commentary, so that message is a little bit harder for students to read just directly. But I will have assigned the students to read those three messages for homework, so they should be at least somewhat familiar with them when we get into class. Then, essentially, what I ask them to do is to go through the messages, working by themselves, with a partner, or with a small group, whatever they want to do, for each message to identify one thing that works well in it, one thing that does not work well, one weakness or problem, and then for that weakness or problem to think about how they would fix it. So those are the three things they have to do. Three things. One strength, one weakness. How do you fix the weakness? I give them some time to work on this. Then we talk about the messages. And primarily, we do start by saying, all right, what works well? And basically, I go through, we do the Target message first, then the Twitter message, then the Microsoft message. So basically, we talk about what works and what doesn't work. And as they identify strengths and weaknesses, I will sort of elaborate on why these things work or don't work. But basically, the idea here is that they're looking at professional samples of actual bad news messages written by real-world companies or CEOs or whatever it is. And I mean, you could do this with any bad news message publicly, any bad news message written by somebody in the professional sphere. It doesn't have to be these three. But the idea is to figure out things that work and don't work so that they can model their own messages on that. So they can figure out what are effective strategies to use and what are strategies to avoid. And that's sort of the goal of the lesson altogether, is to work through the things that work and don't work, so that when they go to do their own writing, their own day-to-day correspondence and things like this, they can utilize effective techniques while avoiding problematic ones.